you, Caroline. Next session is primarily focusing on something that just gets missed in the mission in SDG 4.7. We keep talking of climate education. Of course, it needs the much deserved attention, but we also need to be discussing human rights, equality issues, gender justice, and many other things that peace education that is hardly discussed in platforms that are focusing on SDG 4.7. So with that note, I'll ask Matthew Witenstein to moderate this discussion with Dr. Helen Bond. Just a brief bio of Professor Witenstein. Matthew Witenstein is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Administration at the University of Dayton. His US work focuses on immigrants in higher education and international educational experiences, while his international comparative education research focuses on higher education, education quality, organization, and governance issues. He is a co-editor of the Palgrave Macmillan book series, South Asian Education Policy Research and Practice, associate editor of Journal Diaspora, Indigenous and Minority Education, editorial board member of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, Journal of Student Affairs Research Practice, and of Perspectives in Education. Witenstein is the author of numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Teachers College Record, International Review of Education, Journal of Career Development and Ethics and Racial Studies, and many book chapters. Matthew currently serves as a secretary and executive board member of CIES, Comparative International Education Society, and he's taken many roles, especially in the higher education area at CIES as well. He's been an invited speaker at higher education institutions, ministries, and government agencies throughout the US and South Asia. And Matt greatly enjoys watching tennis as many times a week as possible, and deeply engaging with the world through his travels and making friends. I think that's not added in the bio, but I want to say that he's so good at making friends, and he's such a fantastic person to be with, and I'm one of his friends. I'm lucky to be one of his friends. Over to you, Matt.
My goodness, that's way too nice. I'm very privileged to be your friend, for sure. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Helen Bond here. Helen, I don't have a bio though, and I'm sorry that I'm not sharing a bio. Do you want to share a bit about you?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and just sort of give the bio. I'm a professor, university professor at Howard University in the School of Education, Department of Curriculum and Instruction. My PhD is in human development, and I've done a lot of work with international education, education in terms of in pre and post conflict societies. I was part of a team with the United Nations Development Program, working on a model of a teacher licensing system in East Africa. I've worked with refugee teachers near the border of Somalia, did work on human rights education in West Africa, Fulbright Nero Scholar to India. I'll share some publications around. What I'm going to talk about today is really the intersection of race, the SDGs, and Black history. And so I'm going to kick it off with saying happy Black History Month. So whenever you're ready to get started, I'm ready. And I want to but I do want to start off by thanking the organizers of this, Columbia University, SDSN. Thank you, Matthew, so much for the introduction. Apologies about that bio. And thank you, Radhika, Dr. Ivan, for leading this for the last couple of days, and the audience listening as well as viewing. Thank you.
Helen, I apologize about the bio. That is my fault. And I apologize. Just being at CIS and then another summit right afterwards, I lost it out of sight, out of mind, and I apologize. But I have some great questions that I've got that I've thought through the last couple of days based upon some stuff that I've been in meetings with you through the SDSN network before, and some stuff you sent. So I'm excited to hear your talk, No Justice, No Sustainability. No sustainability, no justice. The role of equity and justice in sustainable development.
Okay, great. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share that before I get started. I do have a lot of slides. This PowerPoint I'm going to share with the organizer so that it can be shared with you. And so let's get started. Just a minute while I share that. Great. That is the title of my session. However, a larger frame I'm going to start with, and then I'm going to work to a very discrete, smaller frame, and that is the intersection of transformative education, race, and Black history. I also forgot to add that I'm co-chair at SDSN USA, and so some of what I'm going to present today represents some of the work I've done there and other places, but also my unique research interest in the intersection of race, SDGs, and this notion of international development in general. So thank you. And we will have time. Do please keep your questions. I'm going to go very fast, but we will have time for question and answer. Before I get started, I do want to give recognition to the Diversity, Equity, and Justice for Sustainable Development Working Group at SDSN. We are working on an SDGs and race dialogue with people of African descent. And so we will let you know when that will be taking place. But I'd like to say thank you to my co-chairs. Hopefully some of them are here today. Framing question. I have so many big questions and big ideas around this. And just listening the last 2 days has really given me new ways to think about my interest and my questions. And what I've been thinking about, and hopefully you have too, can society be both just and sustainable? And I started to reframe that, should society be both just and sustainable? And I think we had a wonderful session on ethics, and the answer would be yes. But balancing these two seems to be a task. And so here are some suppositions that I'm going to start with. And my presentation is going to be based around these 3 pieces, and I hope to thread them together so you have some interesting questions. The first one is, racism is a distortion to the relationship to the natural world. A lot of times we think of racism over here, the environment, the natural world over here. I'm arguing that it is a distortion of that. Racism, xenophobia is a violation not only harmful to people, but is also a deterrent to development that is truly sustainable. That is a supposition that I'm arguing. And I think there is evidence for it. Number 2, transformative education can and should play a role in developing anti-racist attitudes and values and educating about a painful past. And I'm going to do some table setting around what do we mean by transformative education? Where does this fit in with the SDGs? I'm hoping that's going to become very apparent. And my last block, my last supposition is Black history education, not just in February, 12 months out of a year, just the concept of Black history education is transformative education. And I was listening to the previous talk, and I heard transformative education, kitchen sink. And that is a bit true when you look at what transformative education is and how it's defined, situated context within the SDG framework. These are the SDGs. You've seen them throughout this week. Here they are again. If you're just now joining us, they are the 17 goals. I'm focusing on SDG 4, but I'm arguing everything I'm talking about involves SDG 1 through 17. Here is the foundational framing of those 3 suppositions and my question. Goal 4, inclusive, equitable, equality education. And target 4.7, which education you can see, I was listening to the wonderful discussion around human rights education. And so that's also in target 4.7, if I might use the kitchen sink metaphor. But I'll have to say that all these things in the sink are very important. And it's great that they're going to be a little bit more measurable. But my questions, my discussion today is undergirded, founded in target 4.7. Now, more importantly, as we work toward what's transformative education, education about a painful past, how does that fit in? It fits in through the leave no one behind, which is, I mean, and I won't have to say a lot about it. Many of you are familiar with the Agenda 2030. You're very familiar with the SDGs. This is a friendly audience, a familiar audience in that way. We don't hear enough about leave no one behind, because leave no one behind really, even though there's an argument that the SDGs doesn't do as good of a job in some of these areas in terms of race and discrimination, but leave no one behind is really a mechanism in which it can do a better job. And what is that? LNOB and part of the Agenda 2030 framework endeavors to reach the furthest behind. In other words, the development must reach back, and those that are the furthest behind are, the goals are implemented first. It has a specific language that says it requires combating discrimination and rising inequalities within and amongst countries and their root causes. So there is grounding in the original agenda to pay attention to combating discrimination, and discrimination as being a key deterrent to development. And another plank of that agenda, a major cause of people being left behind, is discrimination, including gender discrimination. So what does that look like in this world of environmental justice? Let's bring it closer in. Some really quick studies. I have a citation list, and you can read more about these studies. Some of you may be familiar, but this one from Nature, Racism Drives Environmental Inequality, but most Americans don't realize. And what that particular study was about is that they found that this notion that people living in areas where there are the higher level of heat index or higher levels of pollution index are typically disproportionately poor or minority. But most people, when surveyed, thought that the defining factor wasn't necessarily people were there. Race didn't have anything to do with it. It was mostly people making decisions to live there, or they didn't work hard enough, so they ended up having to live in areas that were near a lot of areas of pollution or a lot of metals in the soil, that those were decisions that people were making based upon their work, their job, or maybe just because they were poor. Of course, poverty does have a lot to do with it. But the study found out that it was disproportionately, they found that racism was a major cause. But most people tend to minimize that, or not to understand how racism could cause that. Another interesting study is, and as I was reading it last night, I was thinking, if we're feeling unwell and we want to see how well we're doing in terms of health, we often take our temperature. Well, you can also take the temperature of your neighborhood and get a sense on how race, poverty, and the rising heat index is worse in areas where people that have been minoritized tend to live. They have higher heat index. And there's a lot of things involved with that, but they have found race and poverty as definitely drivers of people living in places that are extremely hot. And we know that heat can kill. And so getting people to sort of see these things together or to understand how they work together. And they're arguing in both articles that less overt forms of discrimination exist today, but this notion of concentrating minorities in really environmental, undesirable neighborhoods through processes like redlining, segregation, discouraging out-migration, encouraging people to come in through prices and other sorts of methods, as well as, this deeply embedded institutional forms of discrimination, citing people near these particular facilities, were cited as primarily the root of a lot of these environmental injustices. But people tended to attribute them not to institutional practices and policies that are racist and discriminatory. Often they would attribute that to personal choice or to the lack of working hard and making the right decisions. And here's some great pieces too. And it's not that this hasn't been publicized, it's been talked about, but I want to show you the role of history and how these things can be connected and why having historical knowledge and historical reasoning enables you to have better political judgment and judgment about what's happening today, understanding the context, what I tend to call the long view. Racist housing practices from the 1930s linked to hotter neighborhoods today. This is why history is so frightening to so many. A rising heat bakes US cities. The poor often feel it the most. Here's another great study on that. The effects of historical housing policies on resident exposure to intra-urban heat, looking at 108 US urban areas, finding race as a key factor for living in places with a rising heat index. So this is what is particularly disturbing about that, and moving on to having the importance of transformative education, including a historical chronological aspect. Researchers found that these neighborhoods with higher temperatures were the same ones subjected to discriminatory race-based housing practices nearly a century ago. This is why history is perceived as dangerous, often why reading may be perceived as dangerous. And again, I'm arguing, looking at one aspect or looking at Black history can actually fill in some of these gaps, Black history as American history. And thinking about this particular study, what's happening in Black neighborhoods, I've talked a lot about this particular study that that was led by Elena Lynch at SDSN. We all participated in it though, but it is one of the first known attempts to use the SDGs as the measure to assess the racial delivery or the implementation of the SDGs in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the United States. And you can get a sense of some of the things that the authors did find. It's entitled In the Red. I wish I had more time, maybe during our discussion, to talk a little bit more about it. There's a wonderful index with maps that will show you, if you can go to any particular state, if you're wondering why it's called In the Red, you can click on SDG 4, quality education. You can look to see what indicators we use. We also have the source of the data, but you can see in comparison to the white community, most of the United States is in the red. That means the delivery to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities is really at very, very low levels. As a teacher, if you read the report, the grade throughout most of the SDGs were D and Fs. There were some bright spots. I do want to be optimistic because there's room for growth, but I'll maybe say more about this in our discussion. I want to go back to looking at the historical lens and how Black history and history itself can be transformative, can be a transformative education agent. I love this quote by Martin Luther King. We are not makers of history. We are made by history. And I have some more wonderful quotes about that. So what's so special about Black history? How can it be really transformative? How can it be transformative education? Well, first of all, looking back and just making that connection that places that are really hot now were redlined a long time ago. It provides historical knowledge, builds historical reasoning, provides a long view of a longitudinal view of the status of things or the outcomes of things. And it also disrupts this linear freedom that we keep going and we just keep getting better and better, and freedom leads to progress. And I do want to say we have made a lot of progress, and that is very important to acknowledge in the narrative. But it also, historical reasoning, access to history, access to be able to read, books not being centered allows us to make connections from the past to the present. The importance of educating about a painful past. I just want to, and I'm speeding it up because I know time's getting away from us, but some really important work by Kenneth Roosevelt. He's actually the great-great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He makes a really interesting argument here. The book is called The Nation That Never Was. And I was observing him on C-SPAN. I got the book, but he was actually teaching about this to a class. And he was making the argument that the story we tell ourselves, just didn't work anymore. That, country, shining beacon on the hill, inviting immigrants in, that while indeed we are, and we are aspiring to be and emerging in a great country, but that's not how we got started. And it was not in any way linear. And he argues that the morals and the values that shape the world in which we live now were actually shaped through the progress of freedom struggles, the Black freedom struggles, the suffragettes, the immigrant struggles. And that is another reason why incorporating this history, incorporating the right to read, pushing back against book bans, pushing back against the anti-CRT laws is important, he argues, and I argue as well. I love this quote by James Baldwin. Such a great thinker for all times. You think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. I want to talk a little bit about, in this important to educate about a past, the importance of this being thought of as transformative education is the right to read as part of this transformative education model. Let me just scroll down here. I just want to bring in some other thinkers around this. Love the works of Carter G. Woodson. Let's celebrate him during Black History Month. Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. Just a week or two ago, I was downtown Washington, D.C. With UNESCO and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, giving a talk of why it's so important to educate about a violent past and ways in which to do that. Looking at history, biography is a part of that transformative education model. Love this quote here by Elie Wiesel. Without memory, our existence would be barren and opaque, like a prison cell in which no light penetrates. If anything can, it is memory that will save humanity. As I'm working on this, as I was speaking last week, I was thinking about different things that have happened in Florida with banning aspects of Black history and this notion of, eraser, marginalization, and transformative education. Our community, whether it's climate, whether you're focusing on climate education, climate change, whether you conceptualize it in different ways, and we've listened to a lot of broad conceptualizations. I've really enjoyed that. The right to read is critical to transformative education. The right to read is critical to educating about a painful past. Don't have a lot of time to talk about this. We did do a story map at SDSN around the number of book challenges and bans. I always bring it up in all my talks. It's something that we all should be paying attention to, and it is critical. The right to read. Back to right to read and Black history. There is an assault on that. This is just the assault on libraries and teachers, on the work of what teachers are doing. But I want to take it back to a historical lens, because I really do believe very strongly in historical reasoning, and I know there's interpretation is involved in that. But there is a historical, and that's the reason teaching about Black history as transformative education, as a way to do this is important. And it has something to say because reading and literacy has always been threatening. I just showed you a slide there where they're banning books, 400 books from the shelves. I just showed you a list of the top 10 most challenged books of 2021. And now I'm showing you a slide. In 1833, an Alabama law asserted that any persons that shall attempt. So, you know, if you have to learn to read, or even if you're trying to help someone else, you're under indictment. That was in 1833. In 1831, Virginia declares much similar laws. Now I'm going to show, looking at a series of how Black history education, the importance of Black history, and how it is transformative, and why teaching history about a painful past is also transformative. It's transformative in the way that it shows that this linear notion of we just marched, there was, our history was just one march from freedom to progress. And of course, we have made a lot of progress, but it wasn't linear. Teaching about Black history can show you, can disrupt this thinking of that slave life was this sort of codicil on a plantation with overhanging trees, this notion of the brutality of slave life. And we know that transformative education is really well done with primary sources. I'll move along a bit faster so we have lots of time to talk. Just teaching about Black history, for Black history, and through Black history is transformative because it reveals the long view, the longitudinal view. Instead of thinking that people are living in high areas with heat index because they just want to live there, it's a great place to live, that there is a history, a connection of dots or breadcrumbs that Black history can lead you back to. I had a student at Howard University. I teach social studies teachers. We were in the Library of Congress, showing them about how to use primary and secondary sources to do a good job at telling America's story. And I had a student to find this particular picture, showing you just a device that was used on slaves, that a bell would hang there in case they would try to resist. The Black History Month theme for this year is resistance, but this will give you a better understanding of the inequalities today by looking at the history through primary and secondary sources, if you will. Just some really quick slides here. There has been progress. It's not all bad, but it's not linear. There's lots of aspect to it. There's some significant achievements of African Americans in business. This should be taught. Why Black history is transformative. I want to pinpoint something I think is really important, that Black history, while it is crucially important for Black people and for people of color, but it's crucially important for white people as well, for the very same reasons, transformative. History, teaching about a painful past, transformative education also should include the progress we've made, because we have made progress. Here's Brown v. Board. I could put many more slides up about the progress, but I have a sense my time is fleeting. But I want to get to some key messages as we wrap this up in terms of the intersection of sustainable development, anti-racism, racial discrimination, and the role of Black history. Key message. And this was a quote by Du Bois, who really said it much better than I could ever say it, that the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over. We must not remember that Daniel Webster got drunk, but only remember that he was a splendid lawyer. I'm going to paraphrase. We must forget that George Washington was a slave owner, or that Thomas Jefferson had mulatto children, or that Alexander Hamilton had Negro blood, but just only remember him as credible and inspiring. This is why Kermit Roosevelt says, the traditional story we've been telling ourselves just isn't working anymore. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive and an example. If you do this, It paints perfect man and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth. My last three messages, give me another minute or two, wrapping up. Back to this overarching goal of sustainable development, peace, justice, human rights, gender equality, respect for diversity, anti-racism and discrimination should be at the core of sustainable development and education for sustainable development. Otherwise, it is not sustainable, and I'll argue that it is not education. It is the heart of 4.7. Number two, take the long view. Transformative education must include educating about a painful past. And as I said, historical knowledge builds historical reasoning that allows us to make connections from the past to the present. And three, as we build green economies, we need to develop climate adaptation strategies that do not bake in or cement in racial injustice, anti-Blackness into our development plans. That's a big concern. Because if we choose to develop on top of a racist, misogynistic world, then we will simply build in more institutionalized discrimination. And last but not least, since my focus has been on Black history as transformative education, I don't know of anyone who is as transformative is my hero, Harriet Tubman. I want to leave us with this quote: if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. What a just transformational statement there as we close. And just before we close, I did hear someone ask for resources. Never want to leave a discussion without, suggesting the many wonderful resources that SDSN has developed, and UNESCO and other organizations. These are just a part of that. I was instrumental in the development of this and some of these other tools and guides. I do want to point out a book I wrote a chapter for, Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, looking at the role of peace education, especially in terms of truth and reconciliation reports and commissions. Really interesting study that just came out not too long ago for teachers. In the audience, I worked with UNESCO and co-authoring their Trash Hack Action Learning for Sustainable Development, in which we did implement some of these ideas, in that UNESCO always does such great work, as many of the UN institutions. Can't say enough great things about them. This was one of 4 or 5 authors. Teaching Respect for All Implementation Guide does a wonderful, because there's a lot of wonderful tools in the back of this book. And at the beginning, we actually framed them in some really great theoretical ideas. It's 299 pages, but it's a great book, wonderful. There was actually, it was actually field tested at ASPNet schools around the world. ASPNet is the series of schools that UNESCO uses to field test some of its work. And here are the citations if you look more about the, want to read more about the studies, and I hope you do. And last of all, but certainly not least, I am the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Justice Working Group. We don't look at human resource issues, although that's important, and having diverse people in the field. We really look at ways in which that sustainable development can indeed be sustainable, because it's just and it deals with race and discrimination head on. So thank you very much.
What a thought-provoking, I feel like I need 6 hours with you, Dr. Bond, to be able to unpack all of this thought-provoking set of questions you offer us here. So I have a bunch of questions, and I'm just going to sort of just ask a few here and there. So Helen, I'm curious, what foundational skills and knowledges do educators need? And I use the term educators broadly, to teach about the violent past. And what suggestions do you have for organizations that aspire to be transformative?
Great, Matthew, that is a wonderful question. Let's start with the first part of that. what sort of skills, knowledge, and attitudes and values do educators need to educate about a violent past? First of all, they need a rationale. Rationale building is really, really, really important. In other words, you need to be able to articulate why this kind of education is important. Why are you doing it? How does it connect with who you are as an educator? How does it connect with the curriculum? And so it's important to be able to be able to articulate a rationale about that. And some great tools around rationale building, if I might say. I'm also a 3-time Holocaust Institute teacher educator with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have some really wonderful resources around the development of a rationale for teaching about a painful or violent past. Really great tools there. And what's the second part of your question, Matthew? I think I might have got to, but I maybe indirectly, but you'll read it.
The second part, and Helen, I'll keep putting them in the chat as I ask them too. So the second half is, what suggestions do you have for organizations that aspire to be transformative?
Okay. Yeah, when I think about that question, what suggestions do I have for educations that
change our world, Helen?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Matthew, my first thought was when you asked me what suggestions for organizations to be transformative, in my brain, I sort of transformed that, what suggestions for organizations to be anti-racist and to really center racism, discrimination, and xenophobia, because transformation is not going to happen without that. And so that really takes, it takes will. It may take political will. It may take organizational will. And I think organizations should think that that diversity is good for business. Diversity is good for morale. And diversity is essential to sustainable development. It's not an add-on. It's not something I don't want to deal with. It's too touchy. I may say the wrong thing. Why are we talking about this? It's really appreciating diversity and understanding the role of race and racism and discrimination. And so many people have so little knowledge about, why the world looks like the way it does. It's not because the people are this or the people are that, or they made bad decisions. You step back 10, 20, 30 years in history and take an honest look at that. And that's why history education and the right to read and the book bannings are so prevalent, besides being a convenient political tool. I see we have a couple questions, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, so Stacy needs to leave in a second, so we'll take a question from her, and then I have a question, and then we'll go with Averin's question.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bond. You've blown me away. I'm joining from Barbados in the Caribbean, so we have a strong awareness of our colonial history and racism and how important it is to be aware of that history. And I'd put a comment in the chat regarding the links between modern ideas of sustainability and conservation and white supremacy that people a lot of the time don't feel comfortable exploring. But I've noticed that the way that sustainability is presented to us in this modern aspect is this idea, first of all, you remove Black and brown bodies from the very land that they are attached to. We see forced relocations, we see Native Americans put on reservations, and we present this pristine idea of a landscape and nature that is without people, and that's what we seek to conserve, which to me is hugely problematic, because Indigenous traditions to do with sustainability, I'm of Indigenous descent in the Caribbean, stretch back thousands of years. But we associate sustainability and conservation with these modern notions because we don't know enough about the history of sustainability and conservation. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, again, the same people who are disenfranchised from nature, I know Black and brown bodies, and I used to live in the States, and I'm glad I moved back home. Inherently, you don't feel safe in some of these spaces that have to do with nature. And I think we need to, again, hearken to the idea of reconnecting us with the Black history, the Indigenous history that is at the core of everything to do with sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals, and hearken back to that and have that awareness of what it really is. So I just wanted to make that comment and say thank you for making my afternoon. I've missed like all my meetings for today, these sessions. So thank you so much for that.
Stacey, so much for that comment. And I know you're waiting, Avron, and we're going to get right to you. I'll let Matthew handle that. But I just wanted to say a part of my talk, because I was so time conscious, that I've been doing a look back that Du Bois, even though he's not thought of as an environmentalist, had a lot of things to say around that. So that's really a great one. So we'll go to the next questioner, Avron.
If I may, please.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
So we've got
share with you this
Avron. Sorry, Mohammed, we've got Avron and then a question from me, and we can get to you next, I promise.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
our
Thank you.
order of questions. So Avron, please.
Yeah, this was a great presentation, and I sat here and grabbed my Frederick Douglass narrative. Me being from Rochester, I have to do a big shout out to him, because he inspired me in a lot of the work that I do, and being from Rochester, being educated in Rochester. I didn't read that book until I worked at Arlington Cemetery and was a volunteer at the Lee Mansion and had access to the Park Service Library. And so that's when I read that book. Also in understanding and knowing our history and working at Arlington, I learned more about Freedmen's Village, learned about Section 27 where former slaves were buried, got to see Medgar Evers, and I'm putting together a documentary on the Black that are buried there, as well as Jewish Americans that are buried there. There are some that's Jewish Americans that fought in World War II that are buried there, Hispanic Americans that served in the Mexican-American War all the way up. So that this is very important to me, and I appreciate you telling our story and putting that information out there. But one thing I do want to be critical of, and want everybody to be critical of in having the conversation of diversity in the workplace. And I've worked in many places, and I think we have to look at the concept of diversity not just in skin color but in thought, because we can have diversity as far as skin color, but everybody has the same monolithic point of view that could be of white supremacy. And so being able to have that conversation of what actually is diversity. It's not just skin color, it's diversity in thought, it's diversity in presentation, it's diversity in ideas. And so for anybody having those conversations, we have to be critical in that sense. And we can't just be critical in what we see on the outside as diversity. Thank you. And I appreciate you for what you've done. I will be in DC for the NCRC conference next month.
So drop me a line.
Yep.
Thank you. Mohammed?
Helen, so sort of a set of thoughts here. So I always think that the pre-work that we need to do is critical. We can say that we want to do X, Y, and Z, but unless we reflect, acknowledge, and then think about the knowledge and upskilling about the histories of racial and social injustice that are critical for organizations aspiring to embody transformative educational practices first, how can we really do that, right? So I'm curious, Helen, if you could share perhaps what actions and dialogues and pre-work might look like for such an organization aspiring to achieve SDG 4, Target 4.7, and obviously all the SDGs. Who would you suggest should be at the table, and what community and institutional stakeholders should be engaged? It's a lot of questions, and then I'll follow it with what I have them in the chat. What steps should organizations take after those first steps to begin engaging with the SDGs, particularly 4 and 4?
That's a really big question. Let me just say, the general way I'm understanding that question is organizations do to really do a good job with 4.7. And I keep thinking about that metaphor of kitchen sink. But to if you look at 4.7, that's the reason I always like to start with having people read, you know, what 4.7 is, education for sustainable development, you know, and while it definitely includes environmental education, climate change education, I can't think of anything, it's extremely important, but it also says that education for sustainable development also means, you know, gender equality. It can be achieved through human rights education. I was listening to Karen Robinson's very much so. My thoughts are very much so in tune with, you know, human rights education. You can have sustainable development without going through that. So really looking at transformative education, thinking about the goals and mission, purpose, resources of your organization, and thinking about what aligns with that, with 4.7, realizing that, and let me just say this, something that I haven't heard and I think would be important for people wanting to implement SDGs 4.7 or whatever they're going to, they must disaggregate. They must, you know, if you're trying to measure your progress on, are boys doing well in school? Are girls doing well in school? You know, are we having disproportionality in the outcomes of discipline? You know, you just keep, you have to look at, well, how are Black boys doing, Black girls, Indigenous boys and girls, Native Americans, Latino, Hispanic? You have to disaggregate, you know, and try to get disaggregated data in order to develop a policy in terms of implementing 4.7 that is targeted, nuanced, and thereby it will work. And I just like to say that because in the work that we've done at SDSN and the work that many of you have done and are doing, you're fine. And I just heard it yesterday, the importance of intersectionality. You know, we SDSN did some fantastic work with the Poor People's Campaign, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on people that are poor. But I offered the frame, and they thought it was a great frame. You know, I asked the question, well, how do people experience poverty? You know, a white poor male is not going to experience poverty the same as a Black, transgender, disabled person. You know, we may be marginalized, but we experience our life at the intersections. I think Mohammed had a question, and I think we need to maybe go back to him. Matthew, do you think, Mohammed? He had a question earlier.
Yeah,
Mohammed, are you there?
we've got Mohammed next.
And a comment. I
Yes,
really would
please.
like to thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And what I want to say, I share with you this empathy for the fight against racism in general and in the US in particular. Thank you very much.
Matthew, can I say one thing that I didn't get to add in my presentation? And I think it's really, really important because it was getting so long. And a lot of questions have been, well, how to? You know, how do we get kids excited about the environmental movement? How do we get them to be activists and doing some? I want to give a shout out to the Smithsonian Science Education Center. I'm working with them on a wonderful project. Maybe we'll say more about that later. Wonderful work, much appreciative of those colleagues. But what I didn't include, what we can study that is so germane to Black history, and I did a presentation for this, for the Embassy of India, is looking at the civil rights movement and how Martin Luther King went to India and learned about nonviolent direct action from Mahatma Gandhi. He brought those ideas back and implemented what has been called the genius of the civil rights movement, nonviolent direct action. And when I was doing that talk, I discovered that Gandhi was actually a follower, a great admirer of W.E.B. Du Bois, and they had actually had contact. So studying, thinking about, you know, what's a great way in terms of to be an environmental activist. The lessons that was employed in the civil rights movement rang around the world, and they are lessons. I know that was a different context then, but some of the same strategies are useful now. Some of them were employed in apartheid and in other rights-bearing movements. And that's another reason why studying Black history education is transformative. You can look at how that movement, we need allies. We need to be allies to other movements, and we need allies. And it's a great story of allyship. It's a great story of looking at a problem and considering the role of poverty. And it's just, so I could go on forever on that.
That is a really great point. And I have one more. I have so many questions. I've developed like hours of questions for you, and now I have 6 more hours. But I want to ask you one last thing before we sort of move on to the next session. I'm curious whether the SDGs ever had in their purpose to bring about racial justice and peace. I'm curious, A, whether you believe they offer opportunities for bringing about racial justice and peace. And I'm curious what theoretical and conceptual or practical insights you might have that can help educators, and I say educators broadly speaking, and communities begin dialoguing meaningfully about the connection between racial justice, peace, and the SDGs.
Oh, what a great question. What a great question. That's one of the questions that the working group, Diversity, Equity, and Justice Working Group is working on. I see one of my esteemed colleagues, Deepa Vivekas, is in the audience with us. Wave, Deepa. Might be others. I don't know if Victor or Claudia are here, but that's one of the things that we are looking at in terms of making the SDGs real to those communities. But Matthew, I really like Matt, I might say, I really like that. Matt is okay?
Either way.
Okay. I really like that first question. Was the SDGs ever designed to deal with race? And I didn't get a chance to talk much about the special rapporteur on, I'm just looking at my notes for contemporary racism and xenophobia, Professor Akimi, who just published or presented an expert paper to the Human Rights Council in June of 2022 on this very issue, looking at does our modern notions of this development frame that we have, does it really, how does it intersect with race? Does it speak to race? And their findings that it did not do a good job in dismantling or maybe not dismantling, but it didn't do a good job in terms of anti-discrimination and racism. But your question was it really intended to do that? And I don't think that was the intent of the founders of Agenda 2030. However, there is language in the Leave No One Behind, there's the inequality, that would speak to some of the outcomes that you would want to see in an anti-racist world. For example, leave no one behind. We always pronounce it, that's the central plank, LNOB. But leave no one behind, the language, if you look at the document, says you must address discrimination and racism. In terms of development, you must reach back and find those ones that are the furthest behind. That means you have to look, you have to measure to find out who's the furthest behind. And then you have to develop policies, practices, budgets, resources, the political will to actually help those that are the furthest behind. I don't hear that in our discussions around sustainable development and leave no one behind. So it has the mechanisms to do some great things. And I think the SDGs and the Agenda 2030, I think they're a wonderful roadmap. They're what we have. We need to embrace them and we can make them better. We don't have perfect documents, policies, practices. We're in the world we're in and we can make them better.
Yeah, we can use them as, I feel like we can use them as resistive tools, right?
Right.
Whether their initial purpose was for what they were, we can interrogate them and use them.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bond. This was a very provocative conversation. Amazing audience with great questions.
Wonderful audience.
And sort of, for me, an amazing end to a week filled with conversations about sustainability and global citizenship. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow. I think we are all speechless after that discussion. I think it was just so wonderful and so many ideas, as Matt is saying. I think it's and so well moderated. I really enjoyed it. And really, Dr. Helen Bond has made the connection between SDGs, which is very developmental, and all the questions on who's developing who, which agenda, to history. And I think it's really amazing to see how we can learn from history and situate things and see where we want to go. So such a fascinating panel. I think it's really set the stage for not looking at 4.7 with just the climate lens. Climate is one of the discussions, but looking at the much more broader historical underpinnings of where we are, how we reached here is so important. So thank you for bringing that discussion onto stage. We have thematic discussions